Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson on the module A225 Block 3, Decline and Renewal 1880 to 1914, edited by Mackie. Page 202, Unit 19, Popular Culture, Identity and a Lived Experience of the Working Class. Methodism actively engage with working class practices and values. For example, rejecting the model of the paternalistic sermon in favour of empathetic, participative meetings while rejecting certain aspects of traditional artisan culture, especially as it related to alcohol and the pub, and favoured a new way of life, a new leisure culture based on religious values and Christian faith. The Salvation Army was founded in 1865 by a pawnbroker and one-time Methodist preacher from Nottingham, William Booth, whom you encounter in Unit 18. His job had made him keenly aware of the poverty and suffering that remained prevalent in the country, and he felt that traditional churches were too middle class to convince the masses to adopt a Christian way of life. The Salvation Army's followers and volunteers, by contrast, were drawn from the lower working class. We tend to think of charities as organisations organised by the middle classes, but this way was a charity very much organised by working class peoples themselves. This means that army members understood and related to the daily struggles and shared the values of working class people, which was instrumental in the success of Booth's organisation. The organisation's approach was often described by the phrase soap salvation. Its main converts were at first alcoholics, addicts, prostitutes, and other undesirables, welcome in polite Christian society. Show one of the homeless shelters operated by the Salvation Army, known as penny sit-ups. These provided night shelter, warmth, and food to the destitute in exchange for a penny. Although the conditions seem harsh by today's standards, people were not allowed to lie down or sleep on the benches. In addition to night shelters, the Salvation Army provided work and skills training for the poor. In establishments known as elevators, children's homes, recovery facilities for drug and alcohol addicts, maternity hospitals, home visits to poor families, and a number of other services. Booth understood his mission as a war against poverty and religious indifference, and models his organisation on the British Army. Ministers were officers, new members were recruits, and regular members were soldiers. All wore quasi-military uniforms. This language of war was coupled with recruitment techniques borrowed from urban working class culture. The Salvation Army adapted successful techniques from contemporary advertising and entertainment. Its advertisements were almost indistinguishable from circuses and theatre announcements. Hymns were sung to music hall tunes, and congregations were encouraged to respond to their preacher as they would a music hall performer. While it used certain aspects of popular leisure activities to attract followers, it also regarded these activities as rivals to be eliminated and replaced. A core belief of the army was that its members should completely give up alcohol, smoking, gambling, and other activities associated with the pub culture. If we look at the figure of 19.8 in the leaflet, something you would expect from a traditional church, can you some of the ways in which it uses the codes and practices of working class culture? There's no need to write anything down. This leaflet looks more like an advertisement for a festive day than an invitation to a religious meeting. It opens with a cheery attention grabbing line, "Don't read this," and reads like an entertainment program with different activities offered every few hours. These include religious activities, holiness meeting, but also meals, the farewell cup of tea, entertaining talks by the host, reminiscence of the Captain Hillary and Louette, Wilson, coconut life, and band music. These techniques were hugely successful, and by the 1890s, the Salvation Army counted over 4,000 officers in Britain. But the organisation also met with strong opposition from publicans, as well as from owners of lodging houses who resented being undercut by the army's charitable offerings. In southern England in the 1880s, a group of known as Skeleton Army gathered disgruntled critics and disrupted Salvation Army meetings and marches, often violently. The army's military discipline and sect-like favour also worried some middle-class observers. The scientist Thomas Huxley, 1825 to 1895, wrote 12 letters from the Times trying to warn readers against donating to the army, including in December 1890, when he claimed that the Salvation Army was a Trojan horse for socialism. But Booth was no socialist. His ultimate aim was to establish a new socialist society, but rather to ensure Christian salvation. My only hope for the permanent deliverance of mankind from misery, he wrote, was a regeneration of an individual by power of the Holy Ghost through Jesus Christ. In Booth, 1890. In this regard, Huxley's concerns were unfounded. There are, however, clear parallels and links to be drawn between the Salvation Army and the early British socialist movement. Class was an all-important notion in the army, with tracts such as All About the Salvation Army, arguing that the masses should be evangelized by members of their own class and find leaders among themselves. The army was a genuine participatory, if undemocratic movement whose organisation bore similarities with the organisation of the labour movement and labour churches. It is important, therefore, to understand that while the Salvation Army was not a political movement, it did not emerge in a political vacuum. The movement rose to prominence at a time when working classes' consciousness and political organisations were solidifying, and it had both direct and indirect links with the labour movement, as well as the contemporary attempts to merge Christian teachings and socialist doctrines. This is often referred to as Christian socialism, which you encountered in Unit 8. The cooperative movement. A cooperative is an enterprise owned and operated by its members for their shared benefit. The idea of cooperatives can be traced back a long way, as working people sought ways to tackle the rising food prices that accompanied industrialisation and urbanisation. The socialist Robert Owen, 1771-1858, whose New Lanark mills you encounter in the Industrial Revolution, was an early proponent of the cooperative system, but until around 1880, most cooperatives were small and locally based. The movement exploded in the last 2 decades of the century. This was largely due to the rise of the Cooperative Wholesale Society, CWS, which had grown out of the association of 3 individual cooperatives in Yorkshire and Lancashire. It grew rapidly from 1870, supplying products to cooperative stores across England. By 1890, it has established branches in Leeds, Blackburn, Bristol, Nottingham, and Huddersfield, and had extended its activities into manufacturing, farming, and importing. It owned factories producing biscuits, boots, soap, and textiles, as well as its own shopping line. By 1900, there were 1,439 cooperatives in the UK, with around 2 million members in Birchall 1994. The members of the cooperative societies were overwhelmingly and self-conscious working class, but in the period the movement attracted primarily skilled and relatively affluent workers. In his autobiography, the miner Jack Lawton recalls his family joining Newcastle Society in the mid-1890s and comments really that we were getting to be really respectable members of society, although our family finances were still not stretched to store for everything needed. This was cited in Gurney 1996. In fact, the cooperative leaders of the late 19th century did not necessarily believe that the movement should be defined as a working class movement. J.T.W. Mitchell, 1825, 28 to 1895, the son of the Watchdale beer house keeper, who was chairman of the CWS from 1874 to 1895, stated in 1884 speech that in cooperation there were no class interests. He was a devout nonconformist who understood cooperation as a religious ideal of redemption that should ideally be extended to all humanity since God made all men alike. 1996. Nevertheless, the cooperative movement played an important role in the social life of working class districts by organising sporting, recreational and educational activities. The Cooperative Women's Guild in particular was extremely active in promoting social and political goals. The Guild was originally founded in 1883 by a group of women who believed in cooperative ideals but were frustrated by the near impossibility of entering the movement male run administration. While the cooperative principles originally adopted in 1844 guaranteed the equality of the sexes in memberships, in practice, the influence of women was limited to their role as consumers. The women with the basket and the movement itself was run by men. The guild started off with a membership of 50 and the aim to promote the cooperative movement, but it soon expanded into providing instructional and recreational classes for mothers and girls and organising political campaigns on women's issues, including health and suffrage. By 1910, the Guild had 32,000 members and it played a role in lobbying for the inclusion of maternity benefits in the National Insurance Act of 1911. A working class culture. This section has developed a few examples in detail, but it is important to understand that the Salvation Army, the Working Men's Club, and the cooperative movement were all part of a wider trend that saw the emergence of many working class organisations and societies. Some were originally religious in focus, others were political. Still others were socially concerned and with educational or leisure activities, but all these apparently distinct categories overlapped in practice. Colleagues working in the same factory may have joined the local trade union or founded a choir. A congregation may have organised a football team or relief for the poor. Socialist activists could have met at their working men's club or founded a theatre group. Neighbours could have shopped at the local co-op store or attended talks organised by the town's Mutual Improvement Society. At the same time, we need to be careful not to exaggerate the homogeneity and the unity of the working class. If there was a considerable overlap in the membership of the different groups discussed, and if, at times, pursued common or similar aims, there were, I have noted, also significant differences in experience and interest between working people. Levels of skill linked to pay and security of employment was one dividing line, and gender was another. Age, respectability, and religious affiliation might also be important. Nor, despite the emphasis in the unit of the working class organisation and respectability, should we ignore the evidence of a culture that remained loud, spontaneous, and at times violent. As has been emphasised, working class ideas of respectability do not always conform to middle class notions of decorum and privacy. Much life was still conducted on the street, and many activities were mass ones, such as football or holiday crowds. John Lawrence also points to the increasing popularity of open air politics, including outdoor speaking and hustings. From the late 19th century, the crowds attending unruly and hostile towards politicians perceived as toffs. For example, he recounts the experience of the Liberal politician Augustine Birrell, 1850-1933, at his 1900 election in Manchester, which culminated on a polling day with him and his wife being followed through the streets by a hostile mob that spat on them and spattered them with mud from the dirty streets in Lawrence 2009. Looking at the conclusion on page 210, Throughout the module, you have learned about the dramatic rise of the urbanisation, industrialisation in 19th century Britain. This unit has asked how these changes impacted on the habits, values, and representation of ordinary working people. The period witnessed the decline of traditional ways of life, but also the emergence of a new working class culture. In some ways, this culture was starting to resemble today's commercialised mass popular culture. But in other ways, it didn't. For example, levels of ordinary violence is present in working class daily lives, from sports to politics, would have shocked a 21st century observer. The unit has described three major areas of change. First, it traced the emergence of a culture of domesticity that built with a clearer geographical separation between work and the home, and a clearer distinction between work and leisure time. Second, it explored the rise of a new culture of urban popular leisure. Previous patterns of informal sociability at work and local communities declined as leisure time became more clearly defined and formalised. At the same time, the consumption of mass produced goods and entertainment was on the rise, and local pubs and societies were formed to organise leisure time activities. This was a process of rationalisation of leisure time and entertainment, which was occasionally encouraged by the middle classes but also emerged directly from working class inactivities and was given originally meaning by the people who participated in it. Finally, the unit discussed the rise of working class association clubs and societies aimed to improve the social, economic, and moral situation of ordinary people. You learn that associations often merge notions of welfare, religion, class, and politics. That is not to say that the period did not see the rise of working class identity and agency. Most historians would certainly agree that it did. What this unit has tried to show you is that the emerging working class culture was multifaceted and wove together many different identities and cultural experiences beyond this deceptivity, simple notion of class. All in all, it is undeniable that the period saw the rise of the more consciously working class type of political activity. This is what you examine in Unit Political Ferment.